Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and today's video is going to be concerning Torath Mosheh on intermarriage, specifically concerning the issue of Jewishness through the mother. So, the first question that some people ask about this topic is where in the Tanakh is Jewishness defined by the mother? Which is a valid question because most people, especially in the English speaking community, are used to, having this idea that the determination of Jewishness comes specifically from the father. But we'll cover in this video exactly where the concept of Jewishness comes from the mother, where, as compared to that in the Torah and the Tanakh sense, the tribal affiliation as well as, inheritance comes from the father. And that's the way the Tanakh defines it. So let's deal with this issue of exactly like where in the Torah it actually talks about like the mother having an influence on the determination of Jewishness. If we look in the book of Shemot, which is in English called Exodus 21, 2 through 4, 21, 2 through 4, we find the following. Ki thikne aved ivri shesh shanim ya'avod. So this talks about what's called an eved ivri, which essentially the definition of it is someone who's an Israeli person, a Jewish person, who has basically had to sell themselves to serve someone. And this is according to Jewish law, this comes about, for example, if let's say someone was caught stealing and they don't have the ability to pay back and pay the damages for what they've done, then they would basically, have the ability to become what's called an Eved Ivri, where they would work, as this says here, 6 years. And it says, "Vashavi'ith yetzeh lachofshi chinom." So on the seventh year, that's when they go out, once the debt is essentially paid. And it says, "Im bachapo yovo, bachapo yetzeh." Im ba'al ishohu uyotzo ishto imo. So essentially what this section here says, and I think I'll put my annotate on, just to make sure that you're able to see exactly where I'm, actually pointing at here. Give me 1 second. Okay. So if we look at it here, essentially what it says in this next line is that if, this person, for example, came in alone, meaning that they, were not married, and essentially, this circumstance where they become an Eved Ivri takes place, the person that they end up being the servant to, because that's what the Eved is. Eved is like essentially someone who's like a servant, or, some people say in English slave, but in this context, is more of someone who's serving off a debt that they owe that they have no ability to pay. If they come in married, so it says im ba'al ishahu, v'yatza ishto imo. So if he's married, it's not like he goes in and is enslaved and his wife is enslaved or something like that. Or he goes in as a servant, his wife, goes in as a servant. Essentially what happens is that if he's married, he goes in married and he leaves, married. It isn't like, the person he has to, basically serve can all of a sudden say, well, your wife belongs to me. That's not the way that this system works. And the person who is in this position that he's serving also has to provide for this person's wife. But then it says, contrast to that, "Im adonov yiten lo isho." So if the person who he's having to work for, gives him a wife, meaning that he, essentially is someone who, in this position of having to have a wife. And it says, "V'yalado lo vanim ol vanot ho isho v'yalayodaho tiye ladonaho v'hu yetze v'chapo." So essentially, what it says that if his like the person who's in he's serving, gives him a wife, and then essentially there are children, sons and daughters born to this woman who's in this circumstance of, this particular person giving him a wife. And it says that the children, and basically the wife, herself would still be, under the, the authority of this particular person, this is called the Adon. And the Adon is basically saying like someone who's like a master of someone who's in charge of someone. And it says that, the person who's the Eved free, this man, he goes out free, but basically his children and the woman that was given to him as a wife during this period, they still are, if you will, under the authority of the Adon. So this tells us something here. And the thing is that there's kind of another side to this also. This tells us that, for example, in a circumstance, the Adon who's in charge that, who he's having to serve because of this, thing that he did he couldn't pay back, can actually give him like a woman to be with. But this woman that, according to Jewish law, is not someone who's Jewish. It's someone that the Adon has. And these are all like circumstantial situations. It means that it doesn't have to happen this way. But one of the things that happens that we learn here is that this woman who's not Jewish, if she has children by this person who's an Eved Ivri who is a Jew, that the sons and the daughters don't go out with this person. That essentially, that they basically stay with the Adon who provided this person to have a wife. Now, the main issue that the Torah is getting at here is that no Jew should ever want to be a slave. No Jew should ever want to have to serve someone else. You should never put yourself in a position where you should ever be an Aved You should never be an Aved. This should be something that you avoid. But if a person puts themselves in this position, specifically only men can be really considered to be Aved in this way, then, the judicial system has to have them pay back, the restitution somehow, and this is one of the systems in place for that if the person has like completely nothing. And that's one of the issues here that they have to basically be in a situation where they have nothing to pay back and no way to pay this back whatsoever. But it does give us insight into the fact that by him being Jewish, his children, being given a woman who's not Jewish, his children don't go out with him, which means his children are not considered Jews like he is, by this woman who's not Jewish. So then if we continue and we go to Shemoth, Exodus 34:14 through 16, we find the following. It says, Ki lo tishtahaweh le'el acher. So essentially, this is a warning that has been given to the people of Israel during that generation and after to not, go basically bow down to or worship, the concepts of, deity or, the concepts of power that the nations have. And it says, Ki Adonai gano shemo Elogonohu. So it says that, it's like saying that Hashem, is not this something that's good in the eyes of Hashem. By way of using the metaphor of like, that Hashem is jealous of the people of Israel. But again, these are like metaphorical terms that the language of men that's used to describe the Creator. And it says, Pen tichuroth berith liyoshev ha'aretz. Like if, essentially is like don't do this, bowing down to their, concepts of, deity, their concepts of power, things like that. Because, if by doing that, it basically cause potentially the Jewish people to make, a covenant with these people or make connections with these people. And then it says, well, zonu acharei alaham. So it'll cause the people of Israel to almost like, chase after the ways of the different bad concepts of the nations that they're talking about here, in a way to where it's called zano. Now, zano is from the word zanuth, which essentially is like saying like, almost like a harlot or, someone who's like prostituting themselves out. Someone who's, basically, walking away from the Torah in a way to where they're almost like prostituting themselves out to the bad concepts that exist in certain nations. And it says was a wahu lelohim. So you'll basically, do sacrifices to, to their Elohim, their powers or their concerns. So you can also insinuate that this is someone who is giving up something that, doesn't rightfully belong in this place to something that has a bad idea. So essentially it's like saying that this will cause the Jewish people to, turn away from the creator of all things. Now, in connection to this whole idea of bowing down to, the deities, the bad concepts, that various nations may have, which turn a Jew away from the Torah, it says the following. It says, "Welokachto mibanothov levonecho." So, and then it says in the green here, and essentially it's like saying this will cause you to take the daughters of, for your sons, essentially the daughters of these nations that we're talking about for your sons. Wazanu vanothov acharei Elohim, zanu eth banecho acharei Elohim. So essentially, what it's saying here is that if by taking on this, the nations, the daughters of the nations, essentially and giving them to your sons, it'll cause your sons, these daughters who are essentially like, causing your sons to turn away from the Torah and to almost like be like, harlots away from the Torah, or I'm trying to think of the English word that's probably the best, but it's almost like um, turning against the right path of the Torah, which is used to represent kind of like almost like prostituting oneself out away from the Torah. And that's what the word almost implies. It's almost like someone who's prostituting themselves out away from the Torah. And essentially it's saying by giving, the daughters of, the nations that don't keep Torah, in the sense that we're talking about here, to your son, it'll cause him to turn away and it'll cause him to turn his sons away because he'll basically start to, in a sense, turning towards the bad concepts of the people we're talking about here. So this is the imagery it's using the imagery of that time period to kind of, say what the actual, implications are of someone saying to their son, okay, here, marry this, woman over here who's not, keeping the Torah, not a part of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, and what the effects are in a sense. So if we were to look at this from the ancient societies and even some modern societies today, we look and say, okay, well, what's so wrong, about like a Jewish man who keeps Torah wanting to marry a woman who, is from a society where they don't keep the Torah and they do avodah zarah, they do, what in English would be called idolatry. Well, one of the things that this is the Torah is saying here is that what it leads to is that essentially, by the fact that a mother, has more time with her children because of the fact that she carries the children in her body for 9 months or so, or or less, and essentially that most of the nurturing at that early age is going to be at the mother. That the children are going to be heavily influenced by whatever like things that she grew up with and whatever things that she is passing on to them. So a man who keeps Torah obviously would not want his children, worshiping all kind of avodah zarah or turning towards the Elilim, things that are like the Torah warns us to not to do. He obviously wouldn't want his wife doing that, but because she has so much influence, this is one of the reasons that the Torah is saying that the woman is the one who decides the connection to Judaism, and if you will, to the connection to the Torah. The man can teach the children how to be that and that connection, but often he does not have the same influence that a mother has upon her children. And that would mean that by him marrying some woman who does not keep Torah, this would be a bad idea because in some way there's going to be an influence there if she's not dedicated to the Torah. And we'll deal with what it means to say that she would be dedicated to the Torah and at the end of this video. So then let's look at another practical situation the Torah tells us about concerning this issue of determining, where the Torah actually tells us that the mother determines Jewishness. If we look in Bereshith or Genesis 21:10, as well as verses 12 and 13, we find the following story, which says, Watomar Avraham, meaning that this is Sarah who's talking to Avraham or Abraham. And it says concerning Ishmael and also his mother Hagar, it says, Joresh ha'omo hazot, wa'eth bono. So this is the part of the Torah that, where Sarah is telling Avraham that you have to like, using the word almost like for divorce, this Amma, which is like the servant, and her son, Oeth Bono, her son. Now, interestingly enough, it doesn't say your son. It says Bono means her son. And then it continues and says, Ki lo yirash ben ha'ama hazot, ima bani im yishog. So essentially, what she notes here is that, because, this, the son of this Ammon, will not inherit, with, Sarah's son, Yitzhak. And then it continues, going a little bit later into 12 and 13, where it says, and this is like the creator of all things responding to Avraham, noting that, Sarah's prophecy towards the need to make this separation being, a truthful thing and the right thing to do. Hashem says, well, Yomer Elohim, Elohim says, El Avraham, to Avraham, Al yara be'anecho, al hana'ar wa al amothecho. So like Hashem is telling Avraham, don't think it's bad, don't let it be bad in your eyes, concerning what your wife is telling you about, this young man and also like, this servant, girl that is, is his mother. It says, Kol asher tomer alecha Sarah. So everything that Sarah tells you, shma b'kolo. So listen to like Sarah's voice. Listen to what she's saying. Kivi Yishok, because Yitzhok or Isaac, Yigore lecho zara. So Isaac will be called to you Zara. You're like, your descendant, especially in terms of what this like, this inheritance is. And it says, Vagam eth ben Haamo, and also like the son of the Alma, of this servant girl, Leroy Asimanu, I will make him into like a nation. I will put him in a nation. Ki zarechohu. So because of the fact that he came from you, Hashem says, I will make him into a great nation. But he's still being referenced as being the son of this, the servant woman, who is outside of, if you will, the Brit, the covenant that Hashem made with Avram, and that also that we know that Sarah was connected to. So, taking this perspective and going further into the Tanakh, we see in the book of Malachi, chapter 2, 11 through 12, the following, where it says, Halo av echor lechulano, halo el echor borano. So it talks about, it's like basically admonishing, the one part of the people of Israel, the people of Yehuda, or the region of Judea, concerning the fact that Hashem is, essentially the the father of all of Am Yisrael, and that Hashem essentially is also the mighty one of the people of Israel and the creator of all things. And it says Madua nivjad ish be'ochiv lehalel, so like essentially like saying like why like to rebel, a man will rebel, and also like, also to kind of disgrace or, bring down the Brit Avothenu, the agreement or the covenant that was made, between the people of Israel and also the creator of all things. And it continues, says, "Boch tho Yehuda, watho ivo na'asotho b'Yisrael u'v'Yerushalayim." So it talks about this rebellion that Yehuda, the region of Yehuda, is doing, which is like a abomination, in terms of the actions in Israel and also in Jerusalem. And it continues, it says, Ki Hailel Yehuda, that there's this basically turning away from the creator of all things, or you could even say like transgression of Yehuda, of Judea. Kodesh Adonai Asher Ohev, that the going against the creator of all things, and also it says something very interesting here. It says Uva'al bat Elonochor, to basically to marry, or be with, the daughter of a foreign concept of foreign people say in English deities or things like that. Basically like something like saying that by marrying a woman who has a completely different concept away from the Torah, this is like turning the people of Israel away from Hashem. And it says, Yachreth Adonai ish asher ya'aseno. So Hashem will cut off the man that does this. Erwa ona, umehole Yaakov, umajish minho, ladonai tzavaot. So essentially it talks about the man who does this, being turned away from Hashem, and like essentially it's almost like, he's like his tent is taken away from the tent of Yaakov, the tent of Jacob. So then if we look in Ezra 10:2 through 4, we find the situation where the people of Israel, had returned from the first exile after the destruction of the first temple, and were trying to rebuild. But we know that according to Ezra and also Nehemiah, Nehemiah, that there were a number of Jewish men who had actually married foreign wives and had children by them. And we know that this is something that Ezra, started to call out, the leadership at that time, who had done this. And it basically tells us in this particular section of the Tanakh in Ezra, وَيَعَنْ شَخَنْيَا ben Yahiel mibnei Elom. So basically, Shechania, the son of Yehiel, from the sons of Elom, and he says, "Wayomer Ezra." So he says to Ezra, "Anachnu ma'alunu ve'Eloheinu." So we've gone, we've done wrong in the eyes of Hashem. When it says, "Wanoshav noshim nochuriyot me'ameh ha'oretz." So essentially, like, we will return, these foreign wives we have from the nations. It says, "Wa'ata yesh mikwel Yisrael alazot." So there's like, essentially like there's hope for the Jewish people, but that means that they have to make a decision here. And it says, "Wa'ata nichoreth brit le'Eloheinu lahotzi chol hanashim wenolad mahem." So it says that, and now we will make a covenant with the Creator of all things to remove the wives, meaning the foreign wives they had married, and also that those who were born to them. وَهَنُولَدَ مَهَمْ بَعَدْسَتْ Adonai. So according to the advice of Hashem, the creator of all things, he continues and says, وَهَخَرَيْذِيم بَمِtzvot Eloheinu وَخَتَوْرَا يَعْصَى. So essentially they're saying that, they will walk according to the Torah and they'll be, almost like shaking, to do the will of the creator of all things, the commands of Hashem. And they basically state that this is something from the Torah that they will follow. It says, Kum ki alecho hadavar, wa nachnu imach chazak wa'aseh. So essentially, what they've agreed to do is send away wives that they married that were from foreign nations that did not keep the Torah. And also, it's important to note that did not convert to the Torah. And also the children produced by those women. So essentially, if these were Jewish children, meaning that because the father's Jewish, they're Jewish, they would not be able to do this. This is something they could never agree to. They could never agree to send away Jewish children, with foreign wives and say, okay, well, see ya, have a nice day. But, essentially what this tells us is that by them marrying women who had not converted to the Torah, essentially what that meant is the children themselves were not considered Jews, or else they wouldn't have been able to send them away. And then if we continue in Ezra 10 through 12, it says, "Wayokom Ezra HaKohen, Wayomer Alehem, Atem ma'alatem, Tashivu Nashim Nochriot Lehosif, Al Ashmath Yisrael." So essentially, this is where Ezra starts, calling people out about, marrying like, foreign wives who do not convert to the Torah. And he says, "Wa'ata tanu thoda l'Adonai Elohei avotechem, wa'asu ratzonot." So it's like saying now, give thanks to the Creator and then like do the will of the Creator, the Elohei, the mighty one of our fathers. He says, "Wahiv balu me'ameh ha'aretz." So essentially he's calling out the fact that they had been mixed with, the people of the nations who did not convert to the Torah. Umin hanashim hanochoriyot. And also the women, of, foreign women who did not convert to the Torah. What says, وَيَعَنُوا chol hakohol وَيَمْرُوا kol jadol. ki tvorecho alenu la'asot. So it says the entire community, the entire kahal, all the men who, had done this had agreed with Ezra that this is what we're going to do. Again, if this was a circumstance where the mother, doesn't determine the Jewishness of the child, none of this would have been necessary. They could have just kept going as it is and just said, okay, we made a mistake. The people we married aren't exactly into this, but at least our children are Jewish. We don't have to send them away, and maybe we don't have to send the wives away either. None of this makes sense if that was not the case. So then if we go to Nehemiah or Nehemiah 10:29 through 30, we find, a similar, recounting of this whole thing. And it says, Ushar ha'am ha'kohanim ha'lewiyim ha'sha'arim ha'misarorim ha'nathinim. So essentially, he's recounting like, to like the remainder of the Kohanim, the Levim, and also like the leadership of, the people who had returned. He says, "V'chol ha'nivdol me'ameh ha'aratzot ala Torath ha'Elohim nashahem benahem uvonotahem." So essentially, he talks about, this a necessity at that time to separate from, the I guess you could say the lands that they had been exiled to, essentially in this return to keep the Torah and away from the women that they had married that did not convert, as well as the children and things like that of these people. So it's kol yodei amivin machazakin al ahayhem adirehem uvi ovoim ba'olon uvish'ol lelechet b'torat Elohim. So essentially, them doing this whole process that was mentioned in Ezra and also here is something that's being quoted over and over again as being a part of the Torah of Hashem that we mentioned earlier. Asher nutunu biyad Moshe aved Elohim v'lishmor v'la'asot et kol mitzvot Adonai Adonenu u'mishpotov u'hogov. So then we need to consider, okay, what exactly is the goal of marriage in Torath Moshe? And basically, we know that goal is building a Torah-based family. And we know that when we have a situation where, someone is not dedicated to that, especially when it comes to being the mother, the one who's a really strong force in molding, the way the children are because of the connection physically, and biologically a woman has to her children, that we know that there's an effect. And basically the Torah exposes that as something that has an effect, and that's why it's connected to something that's like foreign to the Jewish people to have a situation where if a wife doesn't convert, and doesn't keep the Torah, it can have an effect. And I can give an example of this. I knew a guy whose father was Jewish, his mother did not convert, and she was not Jewish. And because she was Christian, there was a certain point where he and his sister decided to kind of like, keep Christmas because of the fact that they felt kind of guilty that their mother didn't really have anything to do because he and his sister were starting to kind of move into Judaism, bit by bit. But that, essentially also that his mother was the only reason, he did certain things that were Jewish because his father didn't really push that in or even, try to influence him in that way, which is an interesting situation to have a mother that wasn't Jewish seeing the value of it, but then to have the children eventually say, well, let's keep Christmas with, mom because of the fact that we don't want her to feel left out. So let's think about this a little bit further. When in the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam explains the following in Hilchot Isorei Biyah, Perek Yud Bet, which is like Mishnah Torah, the halacha of Isorei Biyah 12. And it says, "Wahaben min hagoyam eno beno sheneamar ki yisir et banecho me'aharai." This is from Devarim Zan Dalet. So essentially, it says that when you have a Jewish man who marries a woman who's not, halakhically Jewish, that essentially it's like his children are not his own children because of the fact that Torah mentions that this situation will turn the children away from the Torah of Hashem and from Hashem. It says Masir Oto Miliyot Acharei Hashem. So essentially, it's like it provides a scenario where the children can turn away from Hashem. It says, "V'davar ze gorem lihidavech b'joyim, v'shiv dalonu hakadosh baruch hu mehem, v'lashuv me'acharei Hashem, v'lim'ol bo." So essentially, what it talks about is, the idea that this causes, a scenario where, the children, and you can say in a general sense, will be easily conflicted towards where, they, will, be placed, for example, conflicted concerning, whether or not you have a mother who is completely outside of the Torah, whether you have a mother who, for example, is kind of, likes it a bit, but then the children, for example, don't fully have a connection within the Jewish people, especially the way the Torah was given in terms of the Jewish people. And then you could even have a situation where, there are some fathers who would we know have no problem basically, having their children disconnected from the Jewish people in a way. So these are all the things that, are issue. Now, there's some people who could say in the modern time that, okay, well, it isn't like it used to be where, you know, that it really meant that because there are some cultures where, a Jewish man marrying someone who's a daughter of that culture where Jews were exiled, could be either a death sentence or it meant that that man had to walk away from the Jewish community. That's what it meant in more ancient times. In more modern times, there are certain, ideas that people have that you can kind of do both. Now, the basic issue is that if you go back to what the Torah is saying, it does have an influence, as I mentioned before. That if a man is very serious about the Torah, he's not going to usually look for a woman who's not involved in the Torah, who doesn't, keep the Torah. Now, again, he's got options there. It's not a problem for a woman to convert to the Torah and for a Jewish man to marry her. That's not a problem at all. It's not a problem for a Jewish man to marry a Jewish woman, who keeps the Torah and keeps it at, the level that he's able to understand and deal with. But once the Torah is saying that, okay, look, there's things that do happen with this reality, and some of it is not as much like you can't really blame the mother. The non-Jewish mother is not really to blame. It's usually the father is Jewish, who, if you will, in this scenario, is the one who's making this choice. And it's not, for example, if he says, okay, I like this woman who's not Jewish, but again, it's going to cause my children not to be Jewish. Is there any way she would convert for the sake of like, the scenario that we're in? And if not, this is not going to be adequate because of the fact that I believe in Hashem, I love Hashem, and I believe in keeping the Torah. Many elements of the Torah require me to have a woman who keeps the Torah with me. And I dealt with this in a previous video, that there's many elements of the Torah for a man that require him to have a Jewish woman with him who's helping him keep the Torah and helping him raise children that keep the Torah. In a scenario where you have the mother who's not involved in that or is not a part of that or doesn't quite get it, you're generally speaking not going to have kids who are very strong in the Torah. You may have some of them that kind of identify as being Jewish loosely or maybe in some way that way, but not someone who's going to be very serious about continuing the Torah to where generations later you have someone who's strong in the Torah because of that scenario. And that's what I'm getting at here, that generally speaking, when you have a man who's serious about Torah, he's not going to look for a woman who is not serious about Torah, even if she's Jewish in many cases. But essentially what you'd be looking at is a scenario where he's going to say, okay, well, my best interest is that my children and my grandchildren, my great grandchildren be Jews, and to keep the Torah. I mean, we've struggled for thousands of years to survive. And how do we survive? We survive by having both men and women who, kept the Torah being together. And there's no problem for someone to convert and join the Jewish people to have that happen. But again, the scenario is if you have someone who, especially as a woman, who is not dedicated to that, you could easily have a scenario where your children are like going astray and you're kind of like, okay, well, how did this happen? And then there have been men that have had this happen. There was one story I know of about a guy who had married a woman who wasn't Jewish. And then when he decided to try to return to the Torah, she wasn't having that. And they ended up getting divorced and he ended up losing a lot in the divorce, because of that. And again, as I said before, the goal of a Torah-based Jew is to be able to create a Jewish Torah-based family. So I don't know of any scenario where someone who was serious about the Torah looked and said, "Okay, I have no problem marrying, a woman who doesn't keep the Torah," or better yet, in the scenario we're talking about, marrying a woman who, obviously is not going to teach my children the Torah correctly. Obviously is not going to, have the know-how or the connection to the community to do that. And obviously, where my children are going to be isolated in terms of what they're getting, because again, they can easily get mixed messages when they are seeing their mother do something that's completely contradictory to their father, and then they see their mother's culture being contradictory to their father. It would make a lot of sense for them to say, okay, my mother's culture as had the upper hand for a lot longer than my father's culture. Let me just be that more than anything else, or let me make how do you say concessions in areas where I really am not supposed to make a concession according to the Torah. And this gets back into something I mentioned in another video concerning what the Rambam mentions in his commentary on the Mishnah, where it says, "V'chasher yiyu kayamim la'adam kol hayesodot ha'elalu va'amanotenu v'hem amitit harei hu nichnas b'chelal Yisrael." So he talks about like the foundations of the Torah. And that, when a man, holds by them, or a Jewish person, you could say holds by them, it's like they're a part of the community of Israel. But then he says, "V'chasher yipakpek Adam biyesod me'ele hayesodot horei ze yatzal min hakalal v'chafar be'ikar v'nikro min ha'epikos v'kotzes ben menatiyot." So essentially what he's saying is that when you have someone who's Jewish, who, if you will, walks away from the foundations of the Torah, It's as if, for example, they have, basically been, removed from the foundation of, what is called, the Torah. And that's when they become the different types of those who separate themselves out from the Torah, which is called Yuliamino Epikuros in the language that's being talked about here. So essentially, what this means is that any woman who has this, that is of interest to a man who keeps Torah is going to be a woman that helps promote him and helps, keep, him in the Torah, as well as, as someone who's going to help raise children in the Torah, so that future generations can look back and say that my ancestors kept the Torah, and this is going to be a woman who, for example, does the things that, is common to the Torah-based Jewish community and promotes it, no matter what culture she comes from. Now, again, this does not negate the ability for women to convert to the Torah because it's happened in different generations, and it continues to this day. But what it essentially means is that when you have a man who's looking for someone to stand by him through all the different challenges he has, and if he's a Jew, he's going to be looking for a woman who's going to help him, survive as a Jew and help his children survive as a Jew. And that, future generations of, Jewish women will look back and say that my mother taught me these things. My mother instructed me in this way. And that essentially, even in the scenario that we find in the book of Ruth, which is also often brought up sometimes, where you have this situation where a Jewish woman named Naomi, who had moved into like area of the Moabites, her two sons had married Moabite women, and then her two sons died. So essentially, everything was going bad for them, and she decides she's going to go back to the land of Israel to be amongst her people. And essentially, what she does is her two daughters decide to go with her. But then she starts saying, okay, well, look, you need to go back to your own people, to your own Elilim, the concepts that you guys had, your deities, go back to that stuff. I'm going to keep going to my people. And Naomi, I mean, no, Ruth is the one of her stepdaughters, or not stepdaughters, her daughters-in-laws, who says, no, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to follow you from wherever. And this is where we get the concept that when someone says, well, what about Ruth? Ruth, wasn't Jewish. But if we look at the story of Ruth, we find something that's very interesting about it. And it says in Ruth 1:16 through 17, وتؤمر Ruth, ألا ترجعي لي لأعزبך לשוב מאחורייך. So essentially what Ruth tells Naomi is, don't tell me to leave you. I'm gonna, basically follow you. And she says, ki el asher telachi elech. So, basically it's like saying, okay, where you go, I'll go. Uva asher talinu alin. Every place where you rest, I'll rest. Amich ami. Your people are my people. Ve'elohayich Elohai. So essentially, it's like the Elohim, the mighty one you follow, the power that you guys follow, the Jews follow. That's also the one I'll follow. So using modern terminology, it'd be like saying the one who created the universe that you guys know about. That's what I'm going to follow. Everything that was Moavi or from the Moabite culture that I came from, that stuff's behind me now. I'm not doing that anymore. The Moabites are not my people. The Jews are my people. The thing that Jews hold by that gave the Torah, Hashem. Hashem is your Hashem. Hashem is my Hashem. Ba'asher tamuthi amuth, v'sham akaver. So essentially, where you die, I also die, and where you'll be buried, I also be buried. It says, Ko yaseh Adonai li. So Hashem will do this for me. V'cho yosif ki hamaweth yafrid beni uvenech. So she makes her strong connection to not only Naomi, but also to the Jewish people and to Hashem. So essentially, this is the format of conversion. That when a person converts to the Torah, they are converting to join the Jewish people, and then after that, that's when they are basically connecting themselves to Hashem. So this is the important part. That, for example, there's some people who love Hashem with all their heart, but they don't love the Jewish people. That is not a conversion according to the Torah and also to the Tanakh. That a person would have to accept that Jews at our worst and at our best is what they're joining, and that they are connecting themselves to Hashem. So in conclusion, we've seen through this whole thing that, the scenario is very clear from the Torah. A Jewish man who is willing to marry someone who doesn't keep the Torah is essentially, creating a scenario where the person who has the most influence over the kids, especially their early education, and especially under circumstances where the man may be like working a lot, not as home a lot, where the mother, for example, is going to be nursing and things like that, where a man is not going to be nursing his children, where the woman is going to be providing a certain level of emotional support because of the fact that children came from her body, if you will. This is something that a man can't really compete with for the most part. And this is something that the Torah is clear that, okay, as a man who keeps the Torah, you shouldn't have to compete with that. You shouldn't have to compete with, trying to make sure your children don't follow your wife's path. That doesn't make any sense. No man who is serious would ever choose to do that. If he's serious, now he may have made a mistake and be wanting to correct it later, but he's going to pay a heavy price for that. So the reality is the Torah is very clear that when you have a Jewish, woman, basically she connects the children to the Jewish people, and that, the ancestry concerning her, the child's father determines, like, for example, the tribe they come from, and things like that. And this is the basis from where it comes from, that, essentially that the mother determines the Jewishness. Now, what I would also suggest the following: if you ever meet someone who's a guy who tells you, for example, I've met some people who try to hold by, this kind of position that there's no oral Torah, and will say, well, the Jew, the man determines the Jewishness of the child, and let's say it's someone who's like religious, they keep the Torah and things like that. Ask them one simple question. Okay, is it permissible for a Torah-based Jew, let's get rid of the oral Torah, no oral Torah, fine, let's go along with that. Is it permissible, according to the Torah, for a Torah-based Jew to marry a woman who does idolatry, and for her to do her idolatry at home? Is that perfectly acceptable? Now, I don't know of anybody, who's going to tell you, yeah, that's perfectly fine if they keep the Torah, if they're serious about the Torah. I don't know anybody who would agree to that, because then they'd be saying for their own children, it doesn't really matter. And if you have a person, for example, whose wife is kind of like on the fence about it, that also tells you something about, what kind of guy you're dealing with. So this is the kind of thing that, is, I think, often not addressed, that, that first and foremost, no man who's serious about the Torah would ever look to say, to have his children raised by someone who's not serious about the same things he is. And that's not, that's true of more than just the Torah. Most people who are serious about something are usually not going to marry someone who's not serious about at least some of the foundational things that they're serious about. So it'd be like someone who is a proud, like, let's say, American citizen trying to marry someone who hates America. That normally is not going to happen. Or like I mentioned in a previous video, so a man who's from Ghana who loves being in Ghana and wants to raise his children as Ghanaian, he's usually not going to marry a woman who, for example, is like proud to be South Korean and wants to raise her children as South Korean, and wants them to speak only South Korean. Those two things, are kind of a separate thing, and this is not to, like, put down, a person who, loves their culture or whatever, but it's mainly to say that generally speaking, people are going to like marry those who kind of, have some of the same goals that they have, especially in terms of when they raise their children. So this is a Hav Ever from the Chronicles of Hav Ever. Thank you for listening. Take care and bye.